Welcome back, everyone. This is Kevin Johnson of Leverage Consulting, and you are listening to yet one more Resilient Entrepreneur podcast. And you know that in the last few podcasts, there's been a series of podcasts where I'm really asking you questions, and I am a huge believer in questions. This one is it's kind of a funny thing and a not so funny thing all at the same time. But I'm sure many of you are familiar with the social media memes that have been or were going around. I think it's kind of peaked and it's kind of dropping off here. But people were talking about, are you a Karen, or don't be a Karen kind of thing. And essentially, and it's funny enough, that was my mother's name. But it was interesting because the Karen thing, I think, was kind of centered around putting a label on people who are typically negative or problematic, or they just like to stir the pot. You know, oftentimes you'd see a Karen sitting at a restaurant table saying, "I want to see the manager," or something of the sort. Well, the question for you is, do we just tend to make things too hard? And I bring this up, and I'm bringing up the Karen thing here because I was on a flight coming home from Colorado recently, and literally one of my favorite places, I think it was the second day when I flew in, overcast skies, wasn't exactly the Colorado that I love to see. And then when the second day I was there, went to do the team training, and I mean, literally it was the picturesque Colorado day where cool, crisp morning, absolutely bird blue skies, not a cloud in sight. It had recently snowed, so all the front range had snow in the peaks. Just gorgeous, beautiful day. But my trip home was interesting because as soon as we got on the flight, now mind you, we're all in this COVID thing together, and depending on the business that you are a patron of, you have to comply. And meaning, like, some places are kind of loose with their expectations or their rules. There are other places that are not loose at all. I mean, in the sense that they're almost to the point of being militant about it. So there are ways to do things and still have your customer appreciate you, like you, and for us not to turn them off. So my theme for this podcast is don't be a Michael. Now, on this flight home from Colorado, we board the plane, we get on, and on every flight I've been on since COVID has started, or we've been in the observation of CDC rules and such. Ever since then, every company has its own interpretation. Some stores literally will say capacity of 1. Some stores mandatory. Some stores come up with all their own little funny ways of reminding customers, put your mask on. Well, Michael went about it with literally the Hammer of Thor. And Michael literally, and I wish I could have recorded it because it was so awful. So awful. The people, myself and everyone around me, were looking around like, and I'm not going to repeat what some of the people said. Because really, afterwards, I think Michael could have stayed in the back of the plane and everyone would have been happy not to see him again. But essentially, Michael said, you're on the flight from Colorado to Denver. Yes, it is mandatory that you wear your mask. That means, yes, you have to cover your nose and your mouth at all times unless you are actively drinking. If you're not actively drinking or eating, then you must put the mask back over your face. If you can't seem to comply with the mask mandate for this flight, then you will not fly American Airlines again, and you will be subject to a $5,000 federal fine. And as I was teaching my client last week, 7% of our communication is just the words that are spoken. Now, I think the words themselves, I could have had Mary Poppins read them, and yes, it would have softened it up a little bit, but it still was not very polite. Secondly, it's the delivery. So we couldn't see his body language. I could imagine it was a wee bit tense and a wee bit, we'll just go with tense. It was a wee bit tense. So your body language is about 55%, but interestingly enough, even as I record this podcast, I'm doing hand gestures and I'm doing different things because it helps me with how I deliver this podcast. 38% is how you use your voice. And I would say he used his voice in a very poor way, in the sense that it was as if we were convicts who'd already, every one of us, all 180 or however many were on that plane, had done something wrong. And all of it was due to how he delivered the message. Now, mind you, it could have been done in different ways where he, yes, asked everyone. He could have reminded everyone. If you've seen the videos of the flight attendants that will actually show you how to click a belt buckle or some of these other things, there's different ways to go about doing this, and it doesn't have to be in a negative way. So same thing on a recent phone call with a client. One of the exercises I gave them was to take all the things they have to, when they find a no, they find themselves wanting to say no, or we can't, that's not my job, we don't do that, we don't have that to offer. You take all those things, and you'll have other examples as well. Take all those things and put them in a bucket, put them on the in a jar, and then randomly draw names. Throw a ball around the room to different team members and have them answer the questions. And ultimately the challenge is say it without being negative. Say it without saying something that's going to turn our customer or our patient off. Because that's typically, I think that's the human side of us typically is we just answer in the very black-white way. Do you do this? No, we do not. As consumers, we don't want to hear that. And the real question for you with all of this is, what do you really want? Do you want to be right, or do you want to be successful? Because the right, wrong, yes, no thing doesn't always work. And human nature, if we get into this yes, no thing, then we tend to end up in a head-to-head type battle, if you will. And people just go into shutdown mode. And once they've gone into shutdown mode, it doesn't matter how much you talk, they're done. So for those of you who have a patient that calls up and says, and asks you a question, for example, do you take my insurance? As soon as you say the word no, you might as well just hang up. Because at that point, they're done. They're not listening to you anymore. You have to find a way to say these things without using negative language. And you might think, well, that's not really negative. It is negative if we're turning them off. It's negative in the sense that it's not positive. Think of it in that black-white sense of it's not positive language. Positive is we hear what we want to hear, or we are given what we want. So in the sense that we've removed the negative, it will now turn it into a positive. So with that said, the one thing that I would love for all of you to do is really just be cognizant of the examples that are around you, like I did with Michael. I listened to a really bad example. My client, I shared the example with the client, and the client said he watched a really good example when he was back home in California at an In-N-Out Burger, and someone says, do you have chicken nuggets? The easiest thing to say is, no, we don't. But what the person at In-N-Out Burger showed them, he turned to the board and pointed at the board and said, here's what we do have. And he ran through the list, which is, if you've been there, it's very short. But essentially, there they were. They pointed at the list and said, this is what we have for you today. Didn't say no. If that person had said to my client, no, we don't have nuggets, oh, that's terrible. Instead of I get them focused on what they can do or what we have available to them. So my message to you, or my challenge to you, is look for the good examples and look for the examples where someone else has already stepped in that pile. Look at those examples and say, I don't want to do these things, and I can shy away from that. Watch the interaction between the two individuals, and you'll see someone tense up or basically leave the conversation even though their body is still there. Just observe those examples and observe other really good examples, and all you have to do is start mimicking people who've done the right thing and start distancing yourself from the people who've done the wrong things. So that, my friends, is your Resilient Entrepreneur podcast. As always, if you have ideas and questions that you'd love for me to answer, please let me know. But I will conclude with, just don't be a Michael.